It's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Paris is Alexis Poulin. He's the co-founder of Monde Moderne and an EU affairs analyst. Tim Bale focuses on politics and parliament as a professor at Queen Mary University in London. Also joining us from London is Ben Lowry. He's the deputy editor of the Belfast News Letter, one of Northern Ireland's main daily newspapers. And with us here in the studio is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for The Guardian newspaper, David Smith. Thank you to all of you for being with us. David, the vote is over. A big defeat for Prime Minister Theresa May, as we reported, the biggest defeat for any British government in almost 100 years. So what did you make of what happened in London?
A total political humiliation for Theresa May and the government. Not surprising, based on everything what we knew from previous weeks about just how unpopular this deal is and how it almost seemed calculated to satisfy nobody. And I think really this day was foretold probably on the day of the referendum itself back in 2016 when the people voted to leave the European Union and there was very little political plan, but it's just been made worse by a series of miscalculations from Theresa May, for example, drawing some red lines, committing to leaving the customs union and single market and the European Court of Justice, insisting that there will be no new hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and a very important miscalculation when she called a snap general election, hoping to improve her majority, and actually weakened her hand considerably. So I think it very much falls into the category of shocking but not surprising, in the sense that we were always heading to this moment and still have no idea what's going to happen next.
But David, if we look at this deal took a long time to get together, this deal. But so did she have many options?
It is extraordinary, as was pointed out today. I mean, this is 2.5 years of work gone up in smoke. 2.5 years of effort for nothing, really. I don't think. I mean, I think she had a bad hand, but she played it badly. And where the bad hand comes in is a party brutally divided, some who wish to remain in the European Union, and then a hardcore of pro-Brexiters who led this campaign and who do seem willing to drive the entire bus off a cliff and are unyielding in that. So it was a very, very tricky situation. And then, of course, on top of that, even the Labour Party is also divided. So it's very hard to find any consensus. You know, and when she went to Brussels, she was up against some pretty implacable European governments who knew that if they made too many concessions, it might tempt other member states to pursue a similar path.
All right, let's go to Tim Bale in London. And Tim, what we do know is that the leader of the opposition in the British Parliament, the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, he's asked for a no-confidence vote that'll take place tomorrow. That's a vote which basically tests the competence of the Prime Minister to hold office. Given that, where does this leave Theresa May politically?
Well, she's in a whole heap of trouble, but she is very likely to win that confidence vote tomorrow, simply because Conservative MPs have no interest in holding a general election. So even those who voted against her tonight will vote for her tomorrow. And the DUP, the Northern Irish party that supports this Conservative minority government, seems to have indicated that it too will support the government in the confidence motion. So Jeremy Corbyn, I think, is the one who's going to be left in a sticky position tomorrow. People will unite around Theresa May and the Conservative Party temporarily. Once Jeremy Corbyn has tried this motion, has failed to get a general election, that then leaves him with the decision of what to do next. She's obviously got to think about what she's going to do in terms of putting together a deal, but he's got to think about whether he wants to now move towards endorsing a second referendum.
Ben Lowry, as we heard from our reporter in London, much of this debate on this vote focused on something known as the backstop. And as our reporter told us, the backstop concerns that border, which is the only land border really between the United Kingdom and the European Union. That's the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Why is this such a sticking point?
Well, the backstop is in many respects quite a simple thing. It's making sure that the border between Northern Ireland, which is in the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, which is independent, is seamless, that it doesn't have checks. But it's actually, at the same time, extraordinarily complex. In fact, some of us have been reporting on it for more than a year, are not entirely sure what it means. And one of the things that it effectively meant, or what unionists felt, what the DUP felt that it meant, was that Northern Ireland would stay in the EU zone. So it wasn't just about the actual checkpoints, which would be very controversial in Northern Ireland in this seamless border that's been seamless for many years, but that it was actually about keeping Northern Ireland in the European Union, and therefore that would mean a border in the Irish Sea, and that would be a divide between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And that's why the DUP was never going to support this deal. But as been said, the DUP is going to support the Conservatives tomorrow for a number of reasons, one of which is, like most Conservative MPs, the DUP doesn't want a general election. The DUP is not in a happy situation. It is propping up a government at a time of chaos, and a government that showed, when it came to the crunch between standing by these unionists in Northern Ireland who, like the DUP, want to be in the UK, and the standing up to the European Union, it wasn't, even when it was propped up by the DUP, prepared to stick with them.
Alexis, there has been a response from the European Union. The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, he tweeted, and this is his tweet, he said, "I take note with regret the outcome of the vote in the House of Commons this evening. I urge the UK to clarify its intentions as soon as possible. Time is almost up. Hashtag Brexit." So, Alexis, what is the EU looking for from the UK government now when Jean-Claude Juncker talks about clarity, getting clarifications? What does that mean?
I think it means seeing what Theresa May has in mind as of Plan B, and if it's possible that there is a vote in the Parliament within the 3 days on a new deal. If not, then there will be a question about what is next, how the EU can help a trusted partner like the UK to manage the transition period. And there would be a lot of question about the timing. Maybe 29th of March is too early for anything, Brexit. And maybe the transition period should go over 2020 and see how we can manage all together to work a deal that works for all the EU partners and the UK, because right now the problem is all about the flux of traveling, planes, boats, people. This can't be just stopped on the 29th of March. There is still a lot to be done. And it looks like the Brexit also, people have been talking in Brussels for more than 2 years, is very unprepared. And that what happened tonight was, again, a very internal thing about the UK politics, but not so much about what is the future of this country. What do the MEPs want for their country, apart from fighting for power or remaining in power to then have a Brexit that doesn't work? Nobody wants this, and certainly not Brussels, because there is too much to lose.
So, Alexis, are you saying then that the Britain's European partners would be flexible on the idea of extending that exit date, perhaps pushing it down into 2020?
I don't know, but it's one of the solutions that was already discussed. The other thing is that the European Court of Justice proposed that simply Brexit could just disappear in history because of Article 50, and the UK could just decide that it was a wrong vote and let's move to something else. So there is a lot to be done to help the UK manage the Brexit. And I don't think that the EU is in a position to try to punish the UK. On the contrary, I think everybody wants to have a fair deal, a deal that works for everyone, and a no-deal option is no good for no one.
David, is that a possibility that the British Prime Minister could go back to the European negotiators and say, look, I need something from you, and they say, well, we're prepared to push the date down the line, and then can she go back to Parliament, another vote?
Yes, I think that's one of the possible scenarios, just postpone this. I think there are objections to that, perhaps more on the British side than the Europeans, in that this political crisis really has been all-consuming for 2.5 years already. And the idea of dragging it on even further, I think, would be mind-blowing for many people in Britain.
Right.
They just want this thing over, because the bottom line is, sure, postpone it for another year, but is anything really different going to happen in that time? Is anything going to resolve it? And I think there are some arguments in favour of saying, stick to the deadline and force it to this moment of climax.
Well, one of the things Theresa May has been saying, she's warning opponents of her Brexit deal that they risk, as she puts it, letting the British people down. We know that the British people voted to leave the European Union 2 years ago. There's also been some talk of a general election, but let's listen to what Theresa May had to say. Let's watch this.
Today's vote is not about what's best for the leader of the opposition. It is about what is best for the country. And at the end of a general election, whatever the result, the choices facing us will not have changed. It will still be no Brexit, leaving with no deal, or leaving with a deal. And there's no guarantee that an election would make the parliamentary arithmetic any easier. All it would gain is 2 more months of uncertainty and division.
That's exactly what you just told us. But what is the likelihood of a general election, and could a new election be framed as possibly a second referendum?
I think after today, a general election is more likely than it was a week ago, and yet probably still a distant prospect, as has been said. Even die-hard Brexiters, the last thing they want is the possibility of Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. So the Conservative Party will close ranks. And what is historically singular about this and complicating is that, you know, you might have expected in this situation perhaps the government to be all for Brexit and the opposition to be against, and therefore, as you suggest, a general election might be in effect another referendum, and it'd be very easy to sort of see who is campaigning on which side. The reality is that in the last election, Labour was pro-Brexit as well. Labour is very deeply divided on this issue. Jeremy Corbyn, for long historic reasons of left-wing socialist suspicion of European capitalism, is really favouring Brexit in many ways. But a great chunk of the Labour Party is bitterly opposed to it. At least, you know, some opinion columnists suggest really Labour needs to rebel against its own leader on this issue. So as things stand, it's not clear that a general election would really resolve anything. Yeah,
there are no clear lines. Tim Bale, the United Kingdom will now leave the European Union if things proceed as they are supposed to. They'll leave without a deal. That means there'll be, I guess, no legal framework in place to regulate or govern the departure and what happens next. This is what the opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, had to say. Let's watch this.
This deal fails to provide any certainty about future trade. It fails to guarantee our participation in European agencies and initiatives. Losing this cooperation undermines our security, denies our citizens opportunity, and damages our industries. Mr. Speaker, the withdrawal agreement is, in short, a reckless leap in the dark.
So, Tim, where does this leave the United Kingdom now? What kind of relationship will it have with the rest of Europe?
Well, if we exit without a deal, that really is it in some ways. We will be treated as a so-called third country. We will trade with the EU on so-called WTO terms. That will mean tariffs on many goods. That will mean delays, certainly for the short term. It could mean a good deal of disruption to supplies to industry, to schools, to hospitals, and even, some people say, to supermarkets and food stores. So the disruption that would come from a no deal would be very, very difficult, I think, to cope with, certainly in the short term. Having said that, I think we need to stress that a no-deal Brexit, although that is the default option in legislative terms at the moment, is actually quite unlikely, because whatever there isn't a majority for in the House of Commons, we know that there is a majority in the House of Commons which wants to prevent a no-deal Brexit. And it's really just a case of how the Commons actually takes control in order to persuade or even oblige the government to extend Article 50 to prevent that happening. I think that although no deal seems like the next step, if we don't get Theresa May's deal, I don't think many MPs buy that. And certainly if we look at opinion polls, that's not an outcome that people in this country want.
Ben Lowry, if we look at today's vote, where does that leave the status of that border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? What does it mean right now?
Well, it means very great uncertainty. For example, if there is no deal, the Irish government's position that the border must be seamless. It will be the European Union, WTO, there'll have to be a hard border. So it's more uncertain than ever. And there's a lot of stalemate in Northern Ireland. There's a lot of polarization across the Western world with Trump and Corbyn and so on. And this is going to get worse. We don't have a government in Northern Ireland. We haven't had a government for 2 years. The relations were pretty bad. Brexit's made it worse. Sinn Féin, which is the party that wants to see Ireland united, wants to see an end to British rule in Northern Ireland, is super confident at the moment. And a lot of the moderate people in Northern Ireland, who overwhelmingly wanted to stay in the United Kingdom, are now questioning whether they want to do that. And there's some very alarming polling. I mean, I work for a newspaper that's very unionist, very pro-British. Our readers want to stay in the UK and cherish that. And a lot of these people, moderate, professional people who would unthinkingly have wanted Northern Ireland to stay in the UK, are now thinking about a united Ireland. So not only is the border up in the air, everything is up in the air, and the DUP holds the balance of power, but it knows that at any moment, my own view is that the talk about general election is actually something that might just stumble into, and they could lose that balance of power immediately. Right. So, and Corbyn's never been sympathetic to Northern Ireland being the UK.
Right, Ben Lowry, that's an important thing you point out there, that most of the people who voted during the referendum in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union. We have a similar situation in Scotland as well. Most of the Scottish voted to remain in Northern Ireland. So could there be some kind of diluted agreement with the EU where these regions, Scotland and Northern Ireland, still have a kind of relationship with the EU without being full members of the EU, of course?
Well, the problem is, I mean, one of the things that we as a newspaper say, because a lot of unionists like this idea in Northern Ireland of the best of both worlds, and it sounds very attractive, and indeed when in effect it was offered to Northern Ireland, people in Scotland were saying they wanted that as well. But what does it actually mean in practice? And that's the thing, when you really grind into it, how you can be effectively in the European Union and still in the United Kingdom, you're getting into territory that doesn't really exist anywhere in the world, or if it does, it doesn't exist in very many places. But I think one of the things about Brexit, some of us who come at it from a unionist perspective were concerned that it would lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. The feeling, it's certainly given an impetus to nationalists, and it isn't a good state of affairs, and a no deal will make that worse. But one of the paradoxes in this is that the very hardline unionists who have allied themselves to Brexiteers, they rather like the thought of no deal. I think that they think that anything that makes a complete break with Europe makes the United Kingdom stronger. So everybody's coming at this from totally different perspectives and with totally different aims.
Alexis, of course, there are all other kinds of implications with Britain leaving the European Union. One of the things that the Charter of the European Union did allow was for the movement of people among the 27 countries. Now, there are, of course, lots of people from mainland Europe, if I could put it that way, living in the United Kingdom, lots of British people living and working in Europe. They've made their lives there. They've lived there for a long time. What happens to them?
Well, tricky situation with this blue passport issue and what will happen of the people, the Brits abroad and the mainland people of EU in the UK. And that's why I think the transition period could be extended, because that would be very tricky to find out what is the solution for these people? People who actually are living in the UK, or the Brits that retired in France, for example, and there are many people like these, and what will be their rights? What will be the deal for free movement? And that was the main question, is that what do you get out of leaving the EU but trouble? If you look at it, what is the plus of a Brexit, whatever the deal, compared to what was existing with the European deal, which was not perfect, but what also putting on the table a solution for these realities that people in Europe are traveling, are moving, are living in different countries, and that was a great solution to have Schengen.
You know, Alexis, as you point out, there is a recognition, a realization now that you know, what you get for wanting to leave the European Union is a load of trouble, and I'm wondering whether that will discourage other countries or groups in other countries, like you have the far right-wing group in Germany, the AfD, which is also pushing Germany to pull out of the EU. Will it discourage them from this kind of action?
Not sure, because it's still something that people are really prone to listen to. In France, we have Brexit also, with UPR pushing for France to leave the EU. And the whole rationale behind this is saying that we can manage, as a big country like the UK or France or Germany, historical countries, to make sure we get deals, bilateral deals, trade or anything else, within the global frame, be it the UN, NATO, or anything else, WTO, and this is enough. Europe was just another layer that is not necessary for big countries. But if you look at it, the reality is very different, because big countries are interlinked.
Right. David, Ben spoke about this. One of the unintended consequences of this vote could be that Scotland pushes for another referendum to be independent. Could you see that happen?
As I understand, the latest polling suggests it's not especially imminent, the Scottish independence movement. Of course, there was a referendum that they lost, and it's not really taken off again. But you can certainly, and clearly, one never rules anything out in the current climate. It's all on the table. Yes, one can certainly see the logical case why, and certainly some people in Scotland are arguing this at the moment, that we did not vote for this. Scotland was clearly in favour of remaining in the European Union, and that would be the final cruel irony for David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, who oversaw both the Scottish referendum and the European Union one, that he was lucky with the Scottish one and got away with it. That may have tempted him to do the European one as well, and yet it's the latter that could still lead to the breakup of the UK, as you say, with Northern Ireland as well.
Yeah. Tim, we're looking at the economic consequences of this vote for the United Kingdom. The financial consultancy EY, which used to be known as Ernst & Young, it says that financial companies have shifted at least $1 trillion worth of assets out of the United Kingdom into the European Union. So are we going to see more of this?
Well, I think we probably will. Businesses, because there's been no certainty around this, have had to plan for the worst case scenario. And of course, their investment decisions are made years in advance. So they've had to, in some cases, cut their losses and make decisions to move money to Europe and even move personnel to Europe. Certainly, if we were to leave with an inadequate deal or even, God forbid, a no deal, I think we'd see a lot more of that. I mean, some of the scare stories around what would happen to the British economy are probably a little bit far-fetched, but it remains the case that the vast consensus of economists, whether they be government economists, university economists, independent think tanks, is that Britain will suffer from leaving the EU, even with a reasonable deal. Albeit, if we do leave with a reasonable deal, it probably won't be so bad that we notice it. The big gain, supposedly anyway, will be that we will be able to negotiate our own free trade agreements with big economies like China, like India and the United States. But the comeback to that, of course, is there's nothing really to stop countries, even in the EU, doing these kinds of deals, as long as they do it as the EU as a whole, which gives them much more leverage, of course, when they're negotiating with these big countries.
Tim, very quickly, I've got about 30 seconds left. Theresa May has to submit a new plan for Britain's next steps by next Monday. That's the 21st. So she's basically got about I guess, 3 or 4 days left. What does she do?
Well, she's got to come to Parliament. She's got to say what she's going to do, but she doesn't necessarily need to focus on the details of that plan. She just needs to set out the next steps to get a new deal or an amended deal, and then bring that back to Parliament in the next few days or weeks. So she's got a little bit more time than people suspect.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.